Alright, so check this out. It was my turn to take the kids trick-or-treating. The previous year it was my wife's, and we trade back and forth every year. My son and daughter are aged 7 and 9. Usually, I stay on the street while my kids go up to different houses to collect candy. After about half an hour of walking around, we came to one of the more popular hotspots for candy collecting, a main street in the neighborhood. Lots of really cool decorations and animatronics on people's lawns, so I became a bit distracted and stopped watching my kids closely. At one point, they came back from a house accompanied by another girl about the same height as my daughter. She was wearing a weird homemade mask, like a cardboard cutout or something. My daughter asked me if she could trick-or-treat with us, so I said sure, and we carried on together as a group. I didn't know who this girl was, but I figured she was a friend from school, and as we continued, I started to notice a large man trailing us. He was wearing some sort of angry cat mask. It was kinda creepy, to be honest. I thought that maybe he was the father of the girl, so I tried to start up some small chit-chat with him. I said something like, "Hey, nice weather, right?" But he didn't respond. He just stood there staring at me while our kids went up the stairs to the next house. I tried again. I said, "Hey, is that your daughter?" He nodded, but didn't say anything. I figured he just wasn't in the mood for chatting, so I stopped trying. We carried on for another 15 minutes until suddenly my kids came up to me and said that they wanted to go home. This surprised me as we hadn't been out for too long and their bags were only about a third of the way full. In any case, I agreed, waved goodbye at the man in the cat mask and his daughter, and started on our way home. The weird thing is that when I glanced back at the man and his daughter, they were just standing there, still staring at us. I checked one more time as we turned the corner and they were still standing there, not having moved at all. At this point, I decided to ask my kids, "So, who was that girl?" My daughter looked up at me with a confused look on her face. "She's your friend," my daughter replied, and I asked her what she meant. Apparently, the girl with the cardboard mask approached them and said she was a friend of mine. She told my daughter she was too shy to ask me if she could join us to trick-or-treat and wanted my daughter to ask me instead. I laughed at this story and replied to my daughter, "Why would you think she was my friend? I don't have any children friends." What my daughter said next chilled my bones. According to her, when the girl with the cardboard mask approached them for the first time, she wasn't wearing the mask, so they were able to see her face. As it turns out, she wasn't a girl at all, but an older woman around my age with wrinkles on her face. And what's even more disturbing, the old woman had started to steal treats from my daughter's bag, apparently when I wasn't looking. This is why they asked me to go home. The old woman was creeping them out, and they wanted just to get away from her. I brought my kids home, and I told my wife what happened. We made sure to check through all of their candy, but we didn't find anything suspicious or off. We didn't call the police or anything since nothing really happened, but thinking back, I kind of regret that decision now. What the heck was that old woman doing? And who was that man following us around? I don't think I'll ever know. I just think it's sick that there are people out there on Halloween hiding behind masks, pretending to be children. Back in 2015, while my friends and I were in our early teens, I hosted annual Halloween get-togethers at my grandparents' house the day before the 31st with a few close friends. Nothing unusual, there's snacks, movies, games, no drugs or alcohol or anything like that. And since my grandparents lived around a quiet circle just outside town, we would take night walks between the hours of 11 or 3 a.m. just to walk and to talk. For a better idea of the layout of the circle, it's a one-way entrance and exit neighborhood. It's about a quarter mile around with a 10 to 15 minute walk at most. It's built on a hill with two flat stretches of road, one on top of the hill and one on the bottom of the hill. For privacy, I'll be using my friend's initials, A, E, and Z. It was around 12 a.m. on our second loop around the circle. Me and A had grouped up while E and Z grouped up having their own conversations. Me and A got a little ahead of E and Z, and lost in our own conversation. I'd say about 20 feet out, we stopped, and then suddenly we could no longer hear them behind us. We waited for them to turn the corner at the top of one side for around 5 or 10 minutes, I'd say, before changing directions uphill to go look for them. Once on top of the hill, we looked down the flat stretch of road and couldn't see them. Thinking that they had changed directions or had stopped further back than we expected, we circled back the other way. We don't remember exactly how many times we stopped or looped the circle, but somewhere in the area of 4 loops, stopping periodically for 10 to 15 minutes to wait and changing directions once or twice. Me and A started getting concerned and decided they probably went back inside the house, so we headed back inside too, but no avail. We sat and watched out the window for around half an hour, hoping that we'd see them finally pass. I remember feeling sheer panic, thinking that I would have to wake up my grandparents and explain how 2 teenage girls have been missing for almost 2 hours at this point. A wanted me to consider waking them up or even possibly calling the police, assuming the worst. Around 1:30 a.m., now I thought they might have left the circle. We decided we'd go out and look for them once more before waking my grandparents. We walked to the entrance of the circle and yelled for them, but we didn't get any answers. Right when we went to loop the circle again, we saw their light coming around the circle from the other side. We ran to them and asked what happened and where they went. They seemed confused and said they'd only been separated us for about 30 to 45 minutes tops. We looked at the phone and it was 2:10 a.m. We made our way back to the house and passed out shortly after. Me and A just felt an overwhelming sense of relief and could only correct the fact that they had been gone for over 2 hours. For a while, we thought E and Z had just pulled a prank on us and hid somewhere in somebody's lawn, but they both claimed to have never turned out their light or changed directions, only once on their last loop. By all means, we should have seen each other. 5 years later, and I've never really stopped thinking about it and brought it up with the group. E and Z never pranked us. I got both their sides of the story. From E and Z's perspective, they were also in conversation and had noticed that we had gone ahead, but they remained going in the same direction, walking at a faster pace to catch up to us, and they did not stop or change directions. They circled in the same direction for 3 loops and then stopped and checked inside the house before waiting in front of the house for us for what they said was about 10 minutes. They decided to jog back around the circle once more before finding us. They never heard us yelling for them, and before telling them how long they were gone for, they are both adamant that they had been gone for less than an hour. It's impossible that we just kept missing each other, considering me and A changed directions as soon as we couldn't see them, while they kept going in the same direction, and the amount of stops that we took, not to mention the time difference. We all agree it's likely they went into an alternate dimension or reality, considering we can't find any reasonable explanation for being in the same place, but on different timelines. We want to recreate the situation, to test it, maybe now that we all have cell phones and we can see if those lines are affected in any way. But in all honesty, I doubt it would happen again. Being as superstitious as I am, I think entries to different realities open randomly, but I do want to experience it myself one day. Until then, this remains the most unexplainable thing that's happened in all of our lives. This happened about 13 years ago when I was a sophomore in college attending a liberal arts school in Suffolk County, New York. Within the first month or two of freshman year, I had found myself in a very tight-knit group of fellow theater geeks, 6 guys, including myself, and 1 girl, and they all loved horror movies and ghost stories. I had found my crew. Freshman year was tough, but we all held each other up and made the whole experience more enjoyable for one another. At the beginning of sophomore year, we decided that in October, as the Halloween season was ramping up, we would find a creepy wooded spot in a nearby town some night and scare the crap out of ourselves. We did some research and found that there was a particularly isolated area about 30 minutes away, infamous for paranormal sightings. It's perfect. The 7 of us split into 2 different cars and headed out into the night. Allow me to set the scene. You turn off a busy main road, flooded with strip malls and restaurants and whatnot, and you're almost immediately greeted by complete darkness. Again, this area was very heavily wooded. It was essentially a large web of winding roads surrounded by trees, very few streetlights, and very few houses. Without a GPS or a good sense of direction, one could easily get lost in there. We all made sure to have fully charged phones and flashlights just in case, but the goal was to keep driving until we collectively decided to pull over and go exploring. So, per the directions, we made a left off of the main road, driving for about 30 minutes or so into this dark network, picking directions at random, just getting lost intentionally. Our cars made a turn, and to our surprise, there was a huge log in front of us. We had reached a dead end of some kind, with nothing but trees beyond it. We all got out to see exactly what this was. We stepped over the log and noticed 2 narrow trails leading in different directions. This seemed like as good of a time as any to grab our flashlights and do some amateur ghost hunting. We flipped a coin and set off on the trail to the right. The trail was so narrow that we had to walk single file to avoid getting whacked by the branches. For whatever reason, I ended up in the back. I'm usually pretty rational and level-headed, but I have to say, the further we went in, the more I was overcome with an uneasy feeling. I kept hearing sounds deep in the woods, unable to shake the feeling that we were being watched. But I seemed to be the only one who heard these things, so I shrugged it off as just my imagination. And in any case, the whole point of us being there was to get scared. Not to mention the fact that we were 7 able-bodied college students. What could we come across that could take us down? We headed down this trail for about 20 minutes, and just when I thought it would never end, we came to a massive clearing, and I mean massive. It was a large, open field of unkempt grass, comparable in scope to a golf course, but not nearly as well manicured. Trees surrounded the entire field, which was so large we couldn't see the end of it from where we were standing. I was thrilled to get out of that narrow trail, but I don't think any of us were expecting to find an area so vast. One of us looked to the right and said, "Hey, check that out." We all turned, and there was an old, dilapidated house several hundred yards away. The house was completely dark, with no cars or signs of anyone actually living there. We walked over and shined our flashlights at it, and sure enough, the windows and doors were all boarded up. I managed to peer between the boards on one of the windows, and what I could see was an old white couch covered in plastic, but an otherwise empty room. Whoever used to live here, they were long gone. Because there was no way in, And because we all felt sufficiently creeped out by the house anyway, we decided to walk closer to the trail that we had come in from, have a seat in the field, and figure out where to go next. We walked towards the narrow trail, but before we could sit, my friend Mark stopped what he was doing. His expression dropped, and he just pointed. We all turned, and on a very far side of the field, directly across from where we had come in, we could see someone tall, lanky, and pale dancing among the trees. And by dancing, I mean it was skipping around, grabbing a tree, swinging around it, and then doing the same to another tree. Basically a do-si-do. The moon was so bright and the woods so dark, it actually took a second for us to really understand what we were looking at. Jay, the 6'4" skeptic of the group, wasn't seeing it. I leaned into him and I pointed in that direction, and I said, "Jay, look where I'm pointing. Don't you see this?" He squinted a bit, and the second he saw it, he gasped with everything that he had. He clutched my arm and whispered, "What in the world is that?" What happened next sent shockwaves through all of us. Whoever this was, they stopped dancing. They looked in our direction and started charging straight at us. Without even thinking, we freaked and ran back to the trail. Yet again, Jay was the only one who didn't see what was happening. He shouted after us, "Guys, what is it? Where are you going?" After about 15 seconds of running like hell, I heard Jay scream, "Holy crap!" I looked back and I saw his flashlight following the rest of us into the trail. While the walk into the woods took about 20 minutes, we made it back to our 2 cars, hopped in, and were peeling away in less than 5. Once we were a safe distance away, we pulled over, got out, and checked in with each other about what had just happened. My heart was pounding, and I knew everyone else was feeling the same way. Nearly 15 years later, we're all still friends, living in different states, yet keeping in touch through marriages, divorces, children. You get it. But occasionally, out of the blue, one of us will send a group text to the others with something to the effect of, "The woods. That had really happened, right?" Well, it most certainly did. That experience is always in the back of my mind, and I'm pretty sure it always will be. Here's the thing that still resonates with me about that night. Whoever that was, they were dancing maniacally in the woods at 1 in the morning, and then ran directly for a group of young adults, not at all fazed by the fact that they were severely outnumbered. Did he know we were there from the second we parked? Was he the sound that I kept hearing when we walked the trail? Whatever the case may be, when he came for us that night, you can be sure none of us wanted to stick around and see what he was truly capable of. This story is so cliche and ridiculous that no one ever believes it's real except for the people that were there. It was Halloween, 2012, my senior year of high school. I went to a Catholic school, so we always had the day off after Halloween because it's considered a church holy day. So my friends were game to start our weekend early. On nights where we didn't go to parties, we usually do the same thing. We'd sit on my front steps for a couple of hours and joke around, then we would walk the neighborhood and usually end up at this crappy pizza place across town because the prices were so cheap. Since a few of us had recently broken up with our girlfriends, we weren't in much of a party mood, so we did our usual. It's around 10 or 10:30 at night, and the pizza joint is closing up. There were 3 of us, me, my friend Pat, and my friend Jack. We finish our food, refill our drinks, and we head out. To get back to my house, we had to cross this large mall parking lot that's about 4 football fields long and maybe 2 wide. I should mention at this point that we aren't dumb, naive kids. We all had grown up in the city and had our fair share of urban experiences. All three of us were pretty streetwise and were competent out on the street by ourselves, but we experienced something this night that we were totally unprepared for. So, we're walking through this parking lot and it's absolutely desolate, not a soul in sight. And suddenly, we see a white tradesman van creeping slowly behind us about 100 yards back. I know, the old white van cliche, but I swear, this is really happening. I point it out to my friends and we pick up our pace. We pop the collars on our jackets and hunch our shoulders to make us seem a little bit bigger than we are. In an instant, the van speeds up and cuts off our path. Everything in the van is pitch black, so we can't see any people. That's when someone calls out in a non-threatening voice, "Hey man, happy Halloween. You guys like Halloween?" Despite the jovial manner in which this was said, a van doesn't just cut you off in a parking lot unless it has very bad intentions. We had nowhere to go. We could run, but they're in a van. They could catch up to us too easily and we'd have our backs turned to them. He says it again. "Hey man, you guys like Halloween?" I respond trying to sound tough. "Yeah, but it's over now, so we're heading home and you're in our way." "No, dude, Halloween ain't over. We still got tons of candy in here." The tone suddenly shifted, and still we can't see anyone in the van. The three of us puff out our chests and get ready for a fight. After a brief silence that felt like it dragged on for hours, Jack cuts the tension by sternly saying, "Listen, I don't know what you think you're about to do, but if you don't leave, we're going to kick your ass." Once he said that, the back door of the van swung open, and two very tall men stepped out. They had on black suits with black leather gloves and were well built and strong looking. But the most menacing thing was that they were both wearing these cheap Mitt Romney masks. That's when we realized this wasn't just a Halloween prank. At that moment, all three of us just went to take off, but the van started driving circles around us. There was no place for us to go. We had no idea how we were going to get out of this situation. And I have no idea what these guys were planning to do with three 18-year-old men, but they seemed like they knew what they were doing, and we were all getting ready for the fight of our lives. The van stopped, and it looked like they were about to make their move. This was it. I mentioned that there were three of us that night. It was at this moment that my other friend, Pat, the one that had stayed silent up to this point, leaned into both of us and quietly said, "This is our Hail Mary. Get ready to run when I say go, all right?" He then picked up one of our sodas and threw it with all his might at the driver's side window. The window was open and the cup miraculously connected with the driver's head. Pat screamed, "Run!" and we took off across the parking lot. The van squealed off in the other direction and we hurried our butts home. Jack and I were both confused as to why a simple cup of soda got them to give up on their plans. Then we found out what actually happened. While we were panicking, Pat kept his cool. He nonchalantly dumped out his drink and slipped a big-ass rock into his cup. Then he waited for the right moment. The driver, thinking that this kid had just thrown a drink at him, wound up getting pegged in the head with a rock. It probably knocked him out cold, or it at least bought us enough time to put some distance between us. All that was left after that was pulling off a miracle and getting the rock to hit. Maybe a guardian angel or God himself took care of that for us. I'm still amazed by it. The moral of the story: don't panic when you're in a tight spot. If you lose your cool, you lose the fight. We had a Halloween party this year. It ran pretty late and the last few people were leaving around 3 a.m. I was chilling out front, and a dude that no one knew was sweeping up the cans and cigarettes that everybody left outside. We live in the city, so this isn't entirely uncommon. He wasn't homeless, but he was clearly down on his luck and looking for tips. I didn't have any cash, but my roommate Mike ran inside to grab some change for him. It ended up only being literal change, but I hung out and offered him a cigarette and chatted with him. He told me he was pretty much on his last chance. It's hard to get a job on parole, and he was doing whatever he could. He told me that not long ago, someone working at a pizza shop said he could sweep their sidewalk, and all they gave him was a quarter and a soda for his efforts. A quarter and a soda. Everyone else was gone, just me and sidewalk dude, so I go up to bed. I'm still pretty hyped from the party, so I'm just laying in bed on my phone for a while. About 30 minutes later, I hear a voice inside my house downstairs. "Mike, you got the soda?" I went downstairs immediately and saw that the door from our kitchen to our mudroom was closed. There's a door from the mudroom to outside. No one ever closes the mudroom door. It's never closed. I went upstairs to get backup, walked to the mudroom door, and said I was going to open it and that they can just leave. Eventually, I got the courage up to just open it, but no one was there. But the door to the outside was wide open. I closed it, I locked it, and I went to the front door. I made sure that was locked too. When I jiggled the doorknob, I heard sidewalk guy say, "Still here, just sitting outside." I don't know what would have happened had I not heard him, but the reason this freaked me out so bad was that he said, "Mike, you got the soda?" After telling me a story about a crappy person asking him to sweep and giving him a quarter and a soda as payment, when Mike had just given him change. Also, because he was in my house. This happened almost a decade ago when I was 13 years old. I remember my friend and I were excited about our first time trick-or-treating without our parents. We lived in a small town where nothing ever happens, and we thought it would be the same that night. It started like any other Halloween night. We collected candy, ran into many of our classmates, and had a lot of fun. At 8 p.m., we realized that we had to head home, but on the way back, we dropped by our teacher's house. She wasn't home, and the street didn't have many streetlights. To add to this, most of the houses had their lights turned off, and their Halloween decorations were taken down. My friend and I were slightly spooked and disappointed by the lack of candy. We wanted to get out of the street as soon as possible. That's when a man emerged from under one of the few streetlights. It was a police officer. Neither of us seemed to notice him before this, possibly due to the darkness. He startled us, but seemed very friendly. The cop introduced himself and pointed to an inconspicuous bungalow. He said an older man living in this house was inviting trick-or-treaters inside. Someone called the police, but when he arrived, no one was answering the door. He kept telling us his police car and partner were just around the block, and we looked around, but we never saw them. I was a pretty paranoid kid. Growing up, my mom loved watching crime shows, and she'd always tell me tidbits of lessons. One of these was a story about fake cops. Although I don't remember the details, I remembered people can pretend to be police officers to gain trust. Throughout this whole exchange, I was terrified. His lack of badge, police car, and partner did not feel right. I was also conflicted because he was smiling and seemed like he just wanted to help. That was until we heard his strange request. He said he needed to speak to this potential predator and needed our help. Since we were young girls, the man would answer if we knocked. The officer claimed he would hide behind the bushes next to the front door. He would wait for him to invite us in, jump out, and then catch him red-handed. At that moment, I knew my friend felt the same way that I did. We both fell silent, but one of us managed to ask if we could discuss. The cop said yes, but told us that we had limited time. The street was silent, and we could hear everything. I remember the feeling of wanting to say something, but fearing he would hear us and escalate the situation. We just stared at each other for what felt like forever. The cop was getting increasingly impatient and told us that we had to decide quickly. Around that moment, a family came down the street and noticed the officer. They were coming over to see what was happening. That's when the cop said he'd be right back and to not go anywhere. My friend and I scrambled to collect our thoughts and decided to run away. We sprinted out of the street and didn't look back. On our way home, we discussed theories that ranged from him being a fake cop, him just playing a prank on us, or him being a real cop and we just misunderstanding the situation. When we told our parents, we downplayed it a lot and doubted our experience. In the end, we didn't call the police, but our dads drove to the house and the area around the house. No cop cars or police officers were in sight. Over the years, I can say that I do regret not calling the police. At the time, my friend and I were convinced that we misunderstood what happened. We even told our class the next day, and most, including our teacher, thought it wasn't that alarming. Looking back, I find it extremely strange a police officer would put two children in such a potentially dangerous situation, moreover with our parents not being present. I wonder what his motives were, but it will, unfortunately, remain unsolved. So, a little backstory. I'm a sophomore in high school. I live on a small street, no more than 18 houses on both sides. It was built entirely to connect two neighborhoods together, and nobody ever passed through it, so my two friends and I knew everyone on it. So around the time I was 9, the three of us went trick-or-treating on Halloween. We got some candy, dropped it off at my house, and headed back into the neighborhood. On our way there, we ran into 6 high schoolers who asked us what we were doing on their streets, which, as mentioned earlier, was odd because we've never seen them before. Soon, we gave them the term the Heather Crest Ghosts, which was the name of the street, and they showed up every Halloween for the next 3 years until we never saw them again. Flash forward to tonight. I invited some of our friends from school for a Halloween get-together where we would play games, get some candy, and just hang out. Later on in the night, the glitch happened. When we were walking back to my house, we walked past 3 little kids. After doing a head count, I confirmed that there were in fact 6 of us. I pointed it out to my neighbors who were there when we first ran into the Heather Crest Ghosts, and we decided to ask them what they were doing on this street. To our surprise, they responded, "We live here." I've never been so confused, as if random strangers claiming they lived on our street wasn't weird enough. Now we're the random strangers. I went and told them that we actually lived here, and they seemed confused, but then left to go get more candy, I guess. Now, here comes the even weirder part. They were the same age as we are now, because, and I'm assuming, they left for college after the 3 years. But other shenanigans happened in the 2 years following the incident. Now, do I repeat what they did? Or is that just me being crazy? For the vast majority of us, when we think about Halloween haunted houses, or fun houses depending on where you're from in the US, we think of good memories of childhood with friends or family. However, the story I'm about to tell you is one that is truly chilling and, sadly, all too real. I grew up around 70 yards or so away from a local haunted forest that ran all throughout the month of October. This wasn't your typical kiddie kind of haunted attraction. It got pretty intense, and before you could even go through, you would have to sign a waiver that stated if you were touched, pushed, shoved, or anyone got too in your face, we'll say, that they wouldn't be held liable for any possible injuries as they were hired actors. Well, the first few years that the haunted forest ran, it was very successful but relatively uneventful. As the attraction's success grew, they became more intense and gory with the storylines and the themes. These individuals owned a lot of land behind their home and would work almost all year getting it ready. As far as I know, there was never any reports of paranormal activity or anything in the area, just stories that they made up. But on October 10th, 2007, things took a turn for the worst that the owners were never able to recover from. The haunted forest opened when I was about 10 or 11, so by the time I was a teenager, I was already pretty used to it. But this particular year, things just hit another level of insanity. Around the end of August, the actors that the owners hired would dress up in gory and disturbing costumes and stand at the edge of the road, waving at traffic, walking up and down the street, and prowling around people's land, looking into their security cameras and even at times trying to knock on their doors. We literally have footage somewhere from one of our old security cameras of some moron dressed up like a clown walking around our backyard. Needless to say, this got pretty scary. My father, who's relatively well known around town, started to hear rumors that the owners were actually hiring ex-inmates as the actors because they would be willing to go farther than any other hired actors for much less money. They started to cause a bit of a stir in my neighborhood, and the police warned the owners of the haunted forest to keep their actors in check. But on October 10th, less than 45 minutes into the haunted forest being open, we saw 3 police cars with blaring sirens cutting in front of the house. Not long after, the police began to send people away, and the attraction was shut down immediately. A girl who lives in our area, who will remain nameless, was stolen from her house the night before and was found very early the next morning crawling out of the woods by a local cul-de-sac. What happened to her from the point she was taken to the point in which she made her way back to the cul-de-sac for help, I honestly don't know, but to be completely truthful, there's enough evil in this world as it is, and knowing that she was okay just became enough for us. The only thing she ever revealed to anyone was that it was 2 of the actors from the forest, in full costume, that abducted her. The police began to do a full search of the forest after apprehending the individuals from their payroll information held by the owners of the forest. The individuals were sent back to a prison out of state, and the forest was permanently shut down, as well as the business license revoked from the owners for not taking proper and attentive care to not hire potentially dangerous individuals. Obviously, this is not always going to be the case. However, the next time you plan on going to any kind of haunted attraction, bear in mind, you have no idea the kind of people that are hiding behind those masks. When I was a little kid, my family, which is my mom and my dad and my 2 older sisters, lived in a condominium complex. The small smattering of condos made up a very tight-knit community where everyone knows everyone. When I was 11 years old in 1993, a new family moved into the complex. It became quickly apparent that these people were going to be very different from our other neighbors, a real unsavory group of people. Their music would blast loudly into the night. Constant shouting matches between the husband and wife would turn violent, and police would be called, and equally unsavory visitors would drive through the neighborhood only to stop by for a few minutes and then leave after product was exchanged for cash. Having had enough of this family's antics, the neighborhood association, made up of the parents of several of my friends, including mine, petitioned the owners of the complex to evict the family, which came to fruition in August of 1993, only a few months after they moved in. Needless to say, the patriarch of the family was not happy. He and his brood had been shown the door, and he vowed to get back at everyone. A seemingly idle threat. Several weeks later, his threat seemed like a distant memory, and with Halloween quickly approaching, preparations were underway for the ghoulish festivities. However, before the 31st, we had to deal with the 30th, which, depending on where you are in this world, is known by several names: Mischief Night, Devil's Night, or in my neck of the woods, it's known as Cabbage Night, due to a long-standing tradition of leaving skunk cabbage, a blood-red flowering plant that smells like skunk and is mildly toxic, on people's doorsteps. This particular October 30th, my mother and I were putting out some last-minute decorations, mainly cheap ones recently bought from a local store called Caldor, and carved jack-o'-lanterns when the smell of burning wood filled our noses. Our initial assumption that someone had a fire going was quickly dashed when an eerie orange glow from the wooded area that separated our complex from the neighboring street could be seen. Soon, a heavy cloud of smoke covered our neighborhood, and the fire department had been called. One good thing about our complex was the fact that the safety complex, where the police and fire departments were located, was basically a stone's throw away. After hooking up their hoses to the hydrants, the fire was quickly extinguished before it could spread to the houses, and the excitement quickly died down. The next day, as us kids excitedly counted down the hours to trick-or-treat time, the adults worried as to the cause of the fire. They unfortunately didn't have to wait long, because a security camera mounted at the complex's entrance provided the answer when an all-too-familiar black pickup truck was spotted entering and then quickly exiting several moments later. While I'm not sure what, if anything, happened to the overzealous former neighbor of ours, he did stop coming around. On Halloween night, when I was around 12 or 11, I stayed up late on my Switch with my headphones plugged in. It was late, at least like midnight, and I decided to go get some water in our outside fridge that was in the garage. I have to mention that my parents had friends sleeping in the trailer outside, so the door was unlocked to go into the garage just in case they came inside during the night for whatever reason. When I got out of my room to go get the water, I brought my Switch with me, and my headphones are still plugged in. But right before I get to the garage door, I decide to turn off my Switch and take my headphones off. I had no reason to do this, and it's not something I'd normally do at that age, but it might as well be the reason that I'm here today. When I put my hand on the garage door handle, now with my ears free, I heard a loud crash in the garage. My body went cold, and it felt like I was made out of white noise. But I didn't freeze. I calmly checked the door handle by turning it slowly as to not make noise, and once I realized it was unlocked, I locked it quickly. Right as I locked it, the door handle started to turn and rattled rapidly 4 times. I ran to my parents' room and I knocked loudly, effectively making them both wake up. And they asked me what was wrong through the door, and I said, "Please tell me one of you is outside in the garage right now." My dad answered no, and after I told him what happened, he said it was most likely their friends just wanting to come in and told me to unlock it. Believing them, I went outside with a kitchen knife. I watch enough horror to know how to be careful. The next morning, my parents asked their friends if it was them, to find out that not only did they hear someone trip and whisper a curse word, but none of them left the trailer that night, and I had effectively stopped and scared off an intruder. The door is now always locked at night now. This happened last year around Halloween time. My boyfriend and I were shopping and saw some Halloween shirts on sale. They were just black with cat eyes on them, and we thought it would be cute to match. We looked for our sizes and looked through the shirts. There are different styles on the shelf with different pictures, but they're organized neatly and we don't pay much mind to the others. We hold up the shirts to ourselves and let the others see. Then we both look in the mirror together while holding up our cat shirts and commenting about how we're already turning into old cat people. He hands me his shirt directly and I have mine already in my hand, and we go to the checkout. We self-check out. I look at both of our shirts before scanning them and then put them in the same bag along with some of our other groceries. It was only one or two other items that we had to pick up. When we get home, we both want to wear them as pajama shirts, and I pull mine out of the bag. It's cute. He pulled his out, and it's a completely different shirt. It's the wrong size, and it's even a completely different pattern. And the pattern isn't even on the front. It's the whole shirt. It's got this orange metallic design all over it. There's no possible way to confuse the shirts. Not to mention, I never put them down, and we went straight to the checkout, where I looked directly at both of the shirts before putting them in the bag and then leaving. We were both extremely perplexed, and honestly, we still are. He threw the shirt out because it was ugly, and again, not his size. I kept mine, but it wasn't as fun since we didn't match. I don't really have an explanation. He couldn't have played a prank on me because I had the shirts the whole time and looked at them multiple times, and it was just such a short time span when all this happened. Whenever I see that cat shirt, I'm left wondering what really happened. Alright, so check this out. I'm not sure if I'm hyper aware or paranoid, but I've had several weird things happen recently and hearing so many others with similar stories too. First, several months ago, I was in a shopping center and a man walking towards me on the sidewalk said, "Hey, you dropped something." I looked him in the eye, but I kept walking. I knew that I hadn't dropped anything. Then about 30 minutes later, I went downtown. It's just a few minutes drive from where I was before. And I was walking in a busy area with a lot of restaurants, and another man said and did the exact same thing. Only this time he was aggressive about it and rude, yelling at me for not giving him a response. Well, the second weird encounter was while walking my dog on a grassy area behind my apartment. The city owns the land, however, I've never seen people walk around there. As I was walking out of a little wooded area there, my dog abruptly turns around and barks at a man that he notices. He acted very surprised when I turned around, and my initial thought was that he was following me. He asked me if I had seen a cat, and then he laughed. I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt that he was nervous, but I still felt weird for days after. Who laughs when they're missing their pet though, you know? Anyway, the last encounter was in my office space that I rent. I have neighbors in the building, and specifically a new one was interacting with me. He came to my door and knocked on it and started to tell me about himself. He told me he doesn't have any friends in the building, and neither do I because, I'm there for work. Our conversation was pleasant, but then he said, "I asked Charlie which car you drive. I never get to see you here, and I was just wondering." He asked for my contact for my business, and I was reluctant between giving my email or my phone number. He acted so frustrated and said just give me one or give me a card. Honestly, I was nervous and just blurted it out in hopes that I'd never have to see him again. When I didn't respond to a message from him a few days later, he came back to my office while I was with a client. He slipped notes through the door, and I decided to tell him politely that I was too busy and not accepting new clients. The friends that I've talked to say just to keep trusting my gut and to keep my distance. I don't leave my office without walking with someone or calling someone now, and I'm just tired of being on edge. This happened a few years ago. We had just moved to a new city, and I was about 11 at the time. There weren't any bus routes that came near where I lived, so my mom had to pick me up from school every day and take me in the mornings. But for this specific scenario, my mom didn't want to have to drive all the way to the school to get me because it was too busy with other parents picking up their kids, so she wanted me to walk to a local gas station and wait for her to pick me up from there. And we did this for a little while. And one of those times, I was waiting out front of the gas station, waiting for my mom to come and get me. I never really felt safe there, so I always stood with my back against the wall and watched the people while they got gas. Most of the time, nobody ever bothered me. They had places to be. But one time, this adult man walked up to me and asked if I wanted a ride home. I was so surprised and scared that he had come up to me that I didn't even hear what he said. So I, wanting to be polite, I laughed and nodded. And then he looked really pleased and started motioning for me to come with him back to his car. At this point, I realized what he had asked me, and I was getting really nervous because I didn't want to suddenly change my mind and tell him no, that I didn't really want to go with him. He noticed that I wasn't following, and he told me to hurry up and come along. I told him that I didn't actually want to, and I'd be okay because my mom should be here any minute. And then he started to argue with me and tell me that it was no trouble and that I really should go with him because I'd get home much faster. He even tried to tell me that if I went, he'd stop and get me something to eat on the way home. I tried really hard to tell him that I didn't want to go, but he kept insisting and he was starting to get closer. I didn't know if I should run inside the store or not, but I was too scared to go anywhere. Thankfully, before he could get too close to me, I saw my mom's car parked on the street where she usually waited. I didn't know how long she had been there, but I told him that that was my mom, and then I ran to her car and I got in. I told her what happened, and she told me that it was good that I didn't go with him, and that next time I should go into the store if anybody bugs me like that. I remember seeing him get into his van while we were driving away, but I never saw him again. Although about a week later, a kid from my school did get into a van with someone and they went missing for a few days. When they found them, they had been assaulted and dumped on the side of the road somewhere, thankfully still alive. All I could think about is that it must have been the same guy, and that could have been me. I'm a 15-year-old male, and yesterday I was on a bike ride at my local park when this dude in a shiny red Jeep Wrangler pulls up next to me and asks me for directions. The conversation transcript is as follows. He says, "Hey, do you know how to get to Darby from here?" I said, "Oh yeah, just go down this road and turn right at the gas station, or..." As I point in the direction he comes from, I say, "Maybe it's that way. I'm not really sure. Sorry, I've lived here for like 6 years, but I'm terrible with directions." The man says, "It's just that my GPS is broken. Where are you from?" This is the point where I'm getting kind of creeped out. This dude's tone, his general vibes, they're just, off. I'm autistic, so I'm not very good at judging tone, but he's using the same voice that psychologists talk to you with during a panic attack. He's not asking for directions like a normal person. I don't know how to describe it, but the way he was looking at me made me really uncomfortable. Answering his question, I said, "Here?" He asked me, "What's your name?" I told him my name. He says his name is Dave, and I say, "Hey, it's nice to meet you, Dave." Dave says, "You're pretty cute." I just said thanks. He says, "Do you want to jump in and have some fun?" At this point, I'm starting to get back on my bike and go home because I'm getting really scared, but I'm trying not to show it because, geez, dude, I don't know if this dude has a gun with him or other dudes or sleeping darts or what, man. All I know is that he's in this big-ass Jeep with tinted windows, and I don't like this situation. He says, "Do you want to stay and chat for a while?" I tell him, "No, thanks. It's almost dinner and my mom's probably waiting for me." Then I biked home, and when I got home, I waited for my mom to finish up her phone call, and I told her what had just happened. She called the police, and, well, that about sums it up. I don't know, I'm just really jittery right now, and I wanted to tell somebody. It doesn't help that I already have anxiety. I go to that park a lot, and I know that a ton of Little League baseball games get hosted there. Plus, there's a kids' soccer camp there this time of year. I'm kind of freaked out, and I really hope they catch whoever it was for the sake of the community. The police told me to call 911 if I ever saw that dude in that car again. So, for some background information, me and my friend are both reasonably scrawny teenage girls. We were camping and it was very foggy outside. It was like in the middle of the evening. So, my friend and I were hanging out at the beach, looking at all the sandcastles from the competition that took place earlier that day, and we had to use the bathroom and wash the sand off of our feet. So, she was washing her feet off and I was going to the bathroom, and I heard the distinct sound of keys jangling. Keep in mind, as I think that this is pretty important. So, after I got out of the bathroom, my friend was waiting for me just outside, and I asked if she had seen anyone leaving the bathroom, but she had just gotten there, apparently. We were just standing around when I heard the keys again. I looked up and I saw a man. He was in his mid to late 20s, early 30s at the latest. He had extremely greasy blonde hair, sunken eyes, a hoodie on with his hood up, and overall a pretty sketchy looking dude. He circled the bathrooms that my friend and I were standing by a few times, and he was always watching us whenever we were in view, which I took note of. My friend still didn't notice though. Anyway, a minute or two later, she asked me if I wanted to go sit at a picnic table with her, and I accepted because I wanted to get away from these bathrooms. So, we walked over to the table, but he followed us, and I know because of his keys. We sat at the table and she was talking to her boyfriend on Snapchat, and I was reading over her shoulder as I normally do. But while I was reading with her, I told her that the guy was watching us and about what I noticed before we went to the table. As I was telling her about that, I felt like I was being watched, so I looked over and I made direct eye contact with the guy who had the keys. After we both gave an awkward smile, he broke eye contact and he walked over to another man who I didn't really get a good look at, and they kept looking at my friend and I. So we got up and walked over to the little playground near where we just were, and we just kind of talked, but this time she was paying attention to where the guys were. Not even a minute later, the two men walked by over to a small patch of woods that had a red car parked near it. Due to where I was sitting, I couldn't see the men anymore, but my friend could, and she said that the blonde one kept peeking back at us from behind a tree, and the other one was out of sight. So we decided to use this to our advantage, and we ran over to the little restaurant type thing, which gave us a clear view of them, and them a clear view of us. The blonde guy got into the car with who we believe to be the other guy. Now, our fight or flight was kicking in, and we both chose flight. So we went behind the restaurant, which was closed and had been for about an hour. We both ran down the stairs to behind a transport truck that had been there since early the day before, so we knew the driver wasn't in there. My friend looked out from behind the truck and saw the car from earlier circling around the area, so as soon as it was out of sight, we ran as fast as we could, and thankfully there were other people around, so we calmed down, knowing that the guys probably wouldn't come for us with other people there. We made it back to our campsite safely and watched movies and stuff before we went to bed, and we didn't see the guys for the rest of the trip. Now, I know that probably wasn't the scariest of encounters out there, but it left us shaken to our core because who knows what would have happened if I wasn't always hyper aware of my surroundings. I'm a 31-year-old female, and I love doing my grocery shopping at night because it's far less crowded and it's a little bit therapeutic for me. This happened just a couple of nights ago. I was leaving from my shift at the hospital, so it's nighttime. I've loaded my groceries into my car and I'm heading home. I'm very much aware of my surroundings at all times, especially at night. I leave the parking lot with no one seemingly around me, no pedestrians or anybody else leaving in their vehicles. The way home for me requires that I turn left onto the main road. And I'm not even kidding, as soon as I've made my turn onto the highway, there was a car right behind me, also pulling onto the highway with me. It looked like there were flashing lights behind me, and I start to panic, thinking, oh shoot, did I make a wonky traffic move? Or maybe there was a police cruiser further up the road, but no, there was nothing. I figured it was just the car behind me hitting a bump in the road and it was their headlights reacting to that. Okay, cool. Now, this road has 2 lanes and I need to make a right turn off of it later. So, I get over in the right lane. Unfortunately, there's a line of traffic full of others needing to turn right as well, sooner than where my turn is, so I safely get back into the left lane to bypass all of the congestion. Now, the other car that appeared from nowhere at the grocery store is far behind me. As I'm bypassing this congested traffic, I see flashing lights again, and I think, okay, cool, I get it, dude. It's now clear that they were the ones flashing their lights at me before as well, and I move over back into the right lane once it's clear, thinking they're definitely trying to tear up the road, right? Well, wrong. Whoever this person is slowly creeping up beside me and coasts alongside me, still flashing their lights. It's a black luxury car, a BMW. I try looking into their cab to maybe see if it's someone I know, but I can't make out a dang thing. They continue to ride beside me for a few more blocks until my gut suddenly clenches up like a fist. I finally let off my accelerator and let them coast farther ahead. They seemed to try to slow down too, but I'm having none of it, and I slow down even more until my turn. I don't even signal, I just veer off and head home. Now, what did I encounter that night? My headlights were on, so they couldn't have been signaling me for that. They were not trying to pass me. My car is brand new, so there were no weird issues happening that they could have been trying to tell me. What were they trying to do with me? I was, and still am, freaked out. Me and my friends enjoy making mountain bike trails in the woods on a mountain near our houses. One day, they couldn't go outside, so I brought my younger sister with me. I was also going to bring my little brother, who was going to be a little bit late since he was at a friend's house. This day was a little bit rainy and it was cold. Nobody would be hiking the trails this day. They had never seen what me and my friends had been working on the past couple of months, so that day was the day to show them. Basically, you walk straight to a trail, and when it turns 90 degrees, You go off the right, off the trail, then around a bend, and there is an overgrown, abandoned forest road. At the end of this forest road, we had a small trail that led to the bottom of our MTB trail. Me and my sister waited for my little brother, but then my mom called me, telling me that my brother didn't know where to go, so I told my sister to go all the way back and wait for him outside the trail in the neighborhood. She never saw him since he decided he didn't know where to go, despite the clear instructions, since my mom then called me once more, telling me that he was back home. Then I called my sister to tell her to come back up the trail, telling her very clearly, make sure nobody's following you. This wasn't for our safety, but so nobody would discover these trails that me and my friends were building. But this time, it was different. As my sister was walking up the trail, I could look from the side all the way across the forest road where she was on her way up. Then I thought to myself, was she wearing a white jacket before? Then I realized, as the figure got more towards the clearing, that this wasn't my little sister. This was a grown man. Nobody would ever find this trail, and if they did, they would have no reason to come up here. Plus, the rain for the past couple of days made the trail mostly muddy, like extremely muddy. I started running down the trail and then behind a tree so that I could call my sister and tell her not to go up the trail. Then I heard, "What are you doing?" It was my little sister. She had already made it all the way up back to the trail, and then I knew what happened. This man followed my sister up the trail. I was terrified, and I can tell my sister started to pick up on that, and I was being very serious. We waited around 10 minutes, but we couldn't see the person anymore. There was no way to go but up the trail towards us, unless this person hid in the trees off the forest road. As we made our way back quickly and quietly, I felt the sense that I was being watched. We made it to our bikes, which were thankfully still there, and I told my sister to pick up her bike so that we could walk through the rest of the trail without the noise of our hubs clicking. This way, we could hear everything going on around us. Then I saw, just towards the entrance of the trail where it was much easier to see footprints, there was one set of large boot prints on top of my sister's small footprints, meaning they were more recent. That confirmed for me right then and there that I was not going insane. We started riding our bikes to the neighborhood where I made sure that we weren't being followed. Luckily, we made it back home. We told our parents, who were glad I was out there as well, and all I could think was, what if I wasn't there? What would have happened to my sister? Alright, so check this out. I discovered this community a few weeks ago, and I keep thinking about perhaps the silliest glitch that I've ever encountered. I'm on vacation right now, so I took a moment to search the old Facebook to find the original post that I made about the incident. This took place in 2016 in Seattle, Washington, USA. Here's what I wrote. I took a walk during my break from work today. On my way up the hill in Madison, I found myself walking behind a guy with a large, fluffy, off-white dog and a woman in an orange shirt pushing a baby carriage. They were walking separately, several yards apart, and didn't seem to be associated with each other. As I was walking out of the parking garage, the guy's dog dragged him into the entrance for a moment to sniff. I believe I was gone for about 35 minutes, then, alas, I had to go back to work. So I waited for the light to change, I crossed Madison, and started walking back down the hill. I found myself following a guy with a large, fluffy, off-white dog and a woman with an orange shirt pushing a baby carriage. They were walking entirely separately. Just before I turned into the alley to go back into the building, the dog dragged the guy into the entrance of the parking garage to sniff. Same people, The guy with the dog was in front, the woman with the baby carriage was second, and I was behind them both times. I have no idea how or why this happened, but it was kind of hilarious. This was an experience that my parents had, but related to me the next day. When I graduated from high school in 1998, we moved down to Monticello, Georgia, into an old farmhouse that my great-grandparents owned. My great-grandmother passed away in 1994, and my great-granddad was in a personal care home, unable to live on his own, and deeded the property to my parents so that it would remain in the family. He would pass away in 2002. The way this house was designed resulted in 2 doors on the front porch and 1 door on the back porch. One door leads into what had always been the living room. The other door leads into a bedroom that's right at the front of the house. My grandmother told me that it was originally a sitting room. The sitting room usually had the nicest furniture that you could afford, but was only used when you had important company visiting, like the preacher. It was adjacent to the dining room, which would have made sense. The immediate household family would eat in the kitchen on any other occasion and would gather in the main room on any other day. But when the preacher came to call, or some other out-of-town or important visitor, you went into the sitting room. After we had lived there for over a year, in late 1999, with a few horses on the farm that my mom bought and wanted to breed, I had worked 3 jobs so far, 2 in retail and 1 at a warehouse that stocked a national brand of hand tools. I worked second shift at the warehouse, and since it was a 30-minute drive, I'd often not get home until about 12:30 a.m., and sometimes even later if I decided to join some of my coworkers at a nearby Waffle House for coffee and pie. Due to the job and work environment, I was required to wear steel-toed shoes. At the time, my ankles were rather weak, and I always seemingly walked on the insides of my feet. To help correct this, I'd always wear high-top shoes or boots. When I would come home from work, I would usually come in through the front door leading directly into my room. The whole house had hardwood floors, and the bedrooms and living room had area rugs to help muffle the sounds of footsteps and to keep the room temperatures somewhat in check. It was literally 2 steps from the door to the edge of my bed, so when I got home, the first thing I did was sit on the bed and take off my boots. I would then be wearing socks to wander through the rest of the house, to use the bathroom, to get a snack from the kitchen, and then finally go back to my room to watch TV before going to bed. However, this one night, my parents heard the door in the living room unlock and then open. They heard my boots walking around on the hardwood floor in the living room, into the kitchen, and into the back of the house where the bathroom and the utility room were. Our old dog, Pete, was asleep in the living room, and when I supposedly walked into the living room, he thumped his tail in greeting. My parents were lying in their bed, wondering when I was going to go into my room myself. I got home maybe an hour after the incident. They were sound asleep, but talked to me the next morning about what happened. They asked if I had gotten up early. I said that I didn't, and they asked why I came in through the living room instead of through my bedroom door, and why I didn't take my shoes off before walking back towards the bathroom and around the rest of the house. I did none of those things, I told them. Maybe somebody did come in the house, snoop around, and then leave. Maybe they were dreaming and thought that they heard me come home. My parents had me worried as well. So, I've been following this channel for a while now, but I've never posted any supposed glitches that have happened to me because, well, honestly, I doubt my own memory a lot. However, these 2 things happened only a day apart, and I am 100% certain that I'm not just remembering wrong or going crazy. The first glitch has to do with my favorite pair of socks. They have frogs on them, and I love them. I specifically remember being really sad a couple of months ago because one sock out of the pair had gotten a hole in the toe. That feeling really bothers me a lot, so I just stopped wearing that pair of socks. A couple days ago, going through my socks to throw away ones that don't fit or have holes, etc., I come across my frog socks again, but they're both completely fine. No holes in the toes. I know it was these socks that had a hole because they were my only frog socks, and I loved them so much. It's so weird, but also really cool because now I can wear my favorite socks again. Thanks, universe. My next glitch was less than 24 hours after the socks. On my hour-long lunch break, I usually get fast food, I sit in my truck to eat it, and then I go to the gas station for a drink and a snack to last me the rest of my shift. That day, I wanted a Mountain Dew and one of those smaller cans of Pringles. I specifically wanted the sour cream and onion can, the little green one. The flavors are on different shelf heights, and the green can is on the very bottom shelf. I know I grabbed the green can because I squatted all the way down to grab it off the bottom shelf. I set my two things on the counter to be rang up. I remember spacing out a bit, just staring at the card reader until the transaction went through, and when I finally saw "remove card," I kind of snapped out of my spacey feeling and went to grab my two things. But my chip can was red. The original Pringle flavor. That flavor is on a whole different shelf, and I know I grabbed the green one, but it was suddenly red. I just shook it off and left with my stuff because I didn't want the employees or other customers to think that I was crazy. I've never had glitches this apparent that I'm so sure of, and I know it isn't just bad memory, but I do feel crazy. I don't know what else to do other than to post it here and see if you find it as weird as I do and maybe have any kind of explanation. So I bring my own computer mouse to work. I'm a weirdo about having a back button on a mouse, and work mice never have them. Anyway, at the end of every day, I go through the same ritual of shutting down and packing up before going home. I pull the unifier out of the work laptop and put it in my mouse. I wrap it in a white washcloth to avoid damage, and then I put it in my bag. I got home one night last week and I couldn't find my mouse. I distinctly remember putting it in my bag because it was the last item that I put in, right on top. Frustrated, I literally removed every single damn thing from my bag. I patted it down, I even shook it upside down, and nothing. And I feel like I go through this quite a bit, and for some reason, this time, I was pissed. Like, I was fuming, and I know I put it in my bag. Well, I went to sleep, I woke up, I grabbed my bag, and I went back to work. Hoping to see my mouse on my desk, I was disappointed when I didn't. So I opened up my bag, and there it is, right on top. It's the only thing in that slot of the bag. Impossible. My anger was certainly disproportionate to the scenario because there's no logic to it, and as much as I try to let it go, it lingers with my subconscious wrestling with the mystery of why? What was this about? Having thrown that kind of tantrum, you better be damn sure that I absolutely made sure I put my mouse in my bag after work the next night. Cursing under my breath the whole time, I wrapped it in the washcloth, tucked it snug alongside the side, zipped up securely, and off I went home for the night. Well, I get home, I open my bag, no mouse. No way. Less than 30 minutes ago, I just huffed and puffed like I was somehow proving to myself that it was in the bag this time. I just collapsed in defeat. I sat on the floor for a long time, staring at the floor, wondering, what the frick is going on? Completely different state of mind, this time sedated and out of sorts. To wrap this up, I went to work, and the mouse was sitting on my desk this time, not in a washcloth. It was just sitting there. Now, The mostly logical part that runs things in my head knows that we have to move on, but there's a faction that's putting up a fuss and is having a very difficult time moving on until the scene is somehow reconciled. In every other area of life, social, professional relationships, interacting with the public, other basic cognitive functions, physical health, recent blood work was perfect. My memory and my recall remains superior to others within a 20-year radius of my age. Things are normal, and there hasn't been any major changes that I can tell or that my friends can tell, and they would most definitely tell me. So, to my alternate that's messing with my computer mouse, what the hell is all this about? Richfield, Ohio, 1992. I was at a campground after a show and I was tripping on mushrooms, and I took a big inhale on a balloon of nitrous oxide, which was laughing gas. At the time, it was easy to get medical dental gas in Ohio, so people were selling balloons everywhere. Well, I was young and crazy and didn't know how insane things got when you do nitrous while tripping. I was sitting at a picnic table and the gas just knocked me out and I fell backwards on my back, but I felt nothing because instantly I was no longer in Ohio. I was laying face down in wet grass, and I look up and I see where I lived when I was 8 years old. I see my mom walking to the car that she had back then, looking just like she did back then, with the late 70s clothes, and she looks at me, and I'm face down in the grass still, and I see concern on her face, and she says something, but no sound comes out, and she slowly starts walking towards me, and boom, I'm back in the campground laying on my back. Now, I'm serious when I tell you that it was as real as it gets. I relived a memory. I later told her and she remembered right away. We were about to go somewhere and me and this neighbor kid were playing and he was chasing me, and apparently while running, he pushed me forward and I landed hard and hit my head and blacked out for a few seconds. That memory was in there somewhere, but I got my head rattled and didn't hit save or something. And 20 years later, mushrooms and laughing gas and falling on my head again replayed those few seconds right after I got knocked out, but not in memory form. It was in real life form. The mind is deep. Apparently, the record button never really stops. The same sort of thing happened again when I was getting a massage on my neck, and in a flash, I was falling through the air seeing a double-lane highway approaching fast. 5 years prior, I was in a big ATV accident and busted through a fence and dropped 20 feet onto a highway. I had a massive concussion upon impact that also took the memory of the fall through the air when I was still fully conscious. Somehow, getting my neck worked on triggered that memory, which was brand new to me. It scared me to death. In my junior year of high school, Shauna, Amanda, Christina, and I were in the same creative writing class. Amanda and Christina were good friends, and Shauna and I were good friends. One night in May of 1994, Shauna and I went out to the movies to see The Crow, and on our way back home, we were talking about how we were pining for our respective crushes. She was talking about John, a French exchange student, and I spoke of Amanda, who was in my art class, and how much I hated the preppy guy that she was dating. I felt she could do better, aka me. Shauna and I talked for hours that night. We hung out for what felt like forever. I distinctly remember this night because as a 90s trenchcoat goth kid, I was in love with The Crow and I went to see it on opening weekend. The problem is, I didn't go on to meet Amanda until my senior year in AP Art in August of that same year. I had known about Amanda, we shared a few classes together, but I didn't actually have a conversation with her until that first day of art class. and I didn't go on to have a full-on crush on her until October. I also know that it's senior year art class because that was the only class her and I had ever sat together in, which is how we got to talking. I went back a few years after and asked Shauna about it, and she distinctly remembers that night happening in junior year as well. All of these events have very strong associations, and the dates can be corroborated by what was going on at the time. To this day, I haven't been able to make any sense of this timeline. This may or may not be the right channel for this, but I'll tell you my story anyway. For as long as I can remember, I've had this memory in which I'm very young, like 3 to 5 years old, and I'm in a very tall building in a kind of mall setting, holding my mother's hand in front of a very small Taco Bell Express. To my right is the Taco Bell and a window looking outside. We were on a very high floor, and there's a building right across from the building that we're in, and that building is connected to ours by a tubular walkway. I can also see the other tube-like walkways going other directions outside of the windows. To my left, there seems to be a kind of lounge and perhaps some other stores. Nothing on the left really sticks out in my memory because it just seemed kind of normal. But the right field of my vision definitely had some kind of futuristic feeling to it. I distinctively remember seeing a large ad in the Taco Bell Express for Mountain Dew Baja Blast. But I was born in 1990, and I've had this memory for as long as I can remember, and the image of the glass tube walkways has always seemed eerily futuristic. Is this some kind of memory of mine from a future past life? I can't remember my mother's face in the memory, only that she definitely felt like a motherly figure, which is partly why I've never brought this up to my actual mom. It would be interesting to hear any of your thoughts on this memory that I've had. You're the first person I've ever told any of this to. For some reason, I never really thought much about it, but it stuck with me for the last 23 years. I don't know where to put this because I don't even know exactly what happened, but I'll give you as much info as I can about the circumstances. This happened back in 1991-ish or so. I'm 99% sure that my first half-sister wasn't born yet. My parents split when I was 3, my brother was 18 months old, and my father had primary custody of us in New York. My mother lived with her new boyfriend, who I greatly disliked, in New Hampshire. During our school vacations, we'd go see our mom. I was very attached to my mom, and I still remember at 33 now being 3 years old and watching her back out of the driveway and never coming back. For a 3-year-old mind, when mommy wasn't back for a few months, that's never. It was traumatic. My dad wasn't the cuddly, explain it like I'm 3 years old kind of dad. I thought he made my mom leave when I was a kid. I resented him, but I loved him because he was my dad. My dad's house was a beautiful home in suburban Long Island. You walk in and there's a dining room to the right, a den to the left, stairs center left, and a hallway to kitchen center right. Walk past the stairs and there's a living room on the left. The eat-in kitchen area was straight ahead of the entryway, with the table being dead center and the kitchen just to the right of that. If you went about 4 feet past the kitchen, there was a half bathroom to the left. Past that, about 10 feet, is the garage on the right, laundry on the left, and in the middle of a French door. This door at the end of the hallway was never used and was always locked. Even the screen door on the outside was locked all the time. It had a ledge of about 8 inches, handy place for a suitcase awaiting approval. And these details are important. Here's what happened next. So, when this happened, I was around 6 or 7 years old. My mom and, at the time, stepdad were picking my brother and me up. I remember my suitcase being one of those 70s style leather rectangles. It was an almost terracotta color. My dad has severe OCD. When I packed for my trip to see him or to come home, my clothes had to be very neatly folded and organized in my suitcase to his specifications. I'd have to redo it or get the belt if it wasn't to his standard. Since I didn't have more than a week's worth of clothes, my clothes had to be washed and dried before packing my bag. I packed my clothes in the laundry room. The hallway with the laundry room always gave me really bad vibes. It didn't have windows or lights the whole length. I always had a feeling that there was something waiting and watching you with ill intent. I yelled out to my dad that my bag was ready for inspection, and I didn't hear anything. Since the house was pretty big, I just set the suitcase on the door ledge and went to go find my dad. And here is where Mom and my now ex-stepdad arrive. I ran to the door, knowing full well that it was my mommy ringing the bell. I was always a mommy's girl. I cried, and we hugged, and I saw my stepdad over her shoulder, cringed, and then went to get my bag. My mom walks into the kitchen. I was maybe 3 feet from the bag when my parents start arguing. I went back to the kitchen because this usually meant someone was going to end up calling the cops. No sense lugging this thing down a 20-foot hallway if I'm not going anywhere. My dad thought it'd be a good idea to have a not safe for work Polaroid of my mom on the kitchen counter when she arrived. My mom and dad are arguing and yelling. My stepdad is just sitting there watching for the moment. My brother and I look at each other and we start silently crying. Then I hear some more expletives being yelled, and now my stepdad has my dad by the throat, about 3 inches off his feet. Time just stopped for me. I closed my eyes and just let out a guttural scream that I still remember to this day. It didn't sound like me, and I remember feeling like I shouldn't have been able to make a sound like that. Next thing I remember is hearing a gunshot, and we're all on the ground with my mom over my brother and me. My dad in front of the fridge, flailing like a turtle on his shell, and my stepdad under the kitchen table. My mom moved her arm just enough for me to look down the hallway and see my suitcase. It wasn't on the ledge anymore. It was blown to singed pieces. My clothes were falling with burning red edges all over. You could smell the cotton burning. My dad ran to the door and opened it, looking for whoever shot at his house. Considering the backyard has a 7-foot fence and the neighbors are no more than 100 feet away on that side, they should have heard that sound too. The neighbors were outside, but it was as if nothing had happened at all. He looked at the door after opening the top half, and there wasn't any sign of a gunshot on the outside. There wasn't any sign of a gunshot on the inside. My dad never owned any kind of weapon like a gun. My stepdad wasn't stupid enough to cross state lines into New York with one. Well, my dad opens the bottom half and inspects both sides. He finds nothing. There was just my suitcase and clothes falling to pieces, burned and scattered about 10 feet down this hallway from the door. I will never forget the look on my father's face when he stood there at that door looking back at me, the only one standing at this point. He just told me to come clean this mess up. I walked down that hallway with a sense of peace that I have never felt since. The next morning at my mom's house was kind of strange. My stepdad wouldn't talk to me. Nothing like that has happened since. I don't have many other weird stories in this regard unless you talk about my ghost hunting days as a teen, but this was a whole different category. I'm not sure if it's a glitch that caused it or a parallel universe colliding with ours for a moment, causing damage, or something completely different, so who knows? I have no idea what happened. Here's the TLDR. My stepdad attacked my dad after Mom saw a not-safe-for-work Polaroid that my dad had left out on the kitchen counter. I screamed a sound that I didn't know I could make. We heard what we thought was a gunshot, and my suitcase, about 30 feet away, blew up. My clothes were shredded and singed, but there were no signs of damage to the house from a gun, explosion, or chemicals, or fire. Alright, so check this out. I'm a female, and this happened right before my 20th birthday when I was in the US Navy. I was stationed at a Navy school in South Carolina the entirety of my enlistment, close to Charleston but not actually in the city. It wasn't uncommon for people with cars to drive into the city, and everyone was friends with someone with a car. Me and my class leader, who's a 22-year-old male, we'll call him P, we were really close, and he was friends with this New Yorker, who's a 19-year-old male that I really didn't like. We'll call him T, but T had a car, so we ended up doing a lot together. One night, after all three of us had tanked an important test, I convinced them to go for ice cream. We decided on this little mom and pop type shop on the far side of Charleston and piled into T's truck. After we had gotten our ice cream, P started giving T directions. T couldn't find his way out of a shoebox, but T insisted that he knew a shortcut and we needed to just enjoy the ride. We didn't have anything early the next day, so I figured, F it, this'll probably be a funny story later when T gets us lost. So we're driving for at least twice as long as it would have taken to get back to base, but T keeps promising that we're almost there. Meanwhile, we haven't seen a building in at least 10 miles, and the road is so dark, I feel like I'm looking into the abyss. T mentions that he has to pee, so P and I tell him to just pull over and take a leak. The road was lined with forest, so he had options to save his dignity, but he insists on pulling all the way off the road. So T finds a dirt road and turns down it, and P and I look at each other and both say he needs to stop. P and I are both from the South, while T grew up mostly in New York City, so P and I both knew how real shoot first, ask questions later can actually be. But T kept saying he was just gonna go a little further through the trees. I'm thinking about how we're going to get shot now because I wanted ice cream when we break through the tree line. About 20 yards in front of us was a big bonfire that was bright compared to the light from the new moon. Immediately, my stomach dropped and P and I both started screaming at T to turn it around. That's when we noticed the figures around the fire and those closing in around us. T was frozen in the driver's seat, so I reached into the front and put the truck in reverse while hitting him repeatedly in the shoulder. T slowly turned around to check behind him to back up, only for him to freeze again. I turned and saw more figures closing around the trail behind us. P, by now, had pulled out a flashlight and was trying to blind the figures while repeatedly telling T to just go and that they'd move. So T starts to slowly make his way back while P's whipping his flashlight around, and I'm making sure all the doors are locked and rolling up the rear windows and closing the back sliding window. The crowd parted like we were Moses and they were the Red Sea, and we made it back onto the road without any other problems. We rode the rest of the ride in almost complete silence, and the three of us have never actually spoken about it since. The only thing that was said on the ride home was when P turned to me and said, "They didn't have any faces, did they?" This is a relatively old story that my dad has told me a few times over the years, but with Halloween coming up, it's been on my mind again. I myself have never been able to witness the house through the description I've been given by multiple men. I myself have never been able to witness the house, though the description I've been given by multiple men 20-something years after seeing it gave me a very vivid mental image. To begin, I'd like to mention that my father is a highly religious man. He's a preacher's son. and doesn't believe in ghosts or anything paranormal in the slightest. Nothing seems to spook him either, but he still swears up and down that he felt something unnatural that scared the crap out of him, even just from mentioning the story to me on the rare occasion that he would bring it up. Well, back in the late 80s, he and a few friends would regularly hike over the waterfall/creek bed behind our farm and would follow the trails up until they eventually met the frontage road off of the interstate. Well, one night, they decided to take a different route and go around the backside of another farmer's land, mostly to see the animals because they owned emus and other large pets that weren't common in the local area. Supposedly, after leaving the area and continuing into the woods, at night, of all wonderful times, they managed to stumble upon what's described by all five men as a Blair Witch look-alike house. It was a very, very old home, and my dad claims that just looking at it gave him this ominous feeling. But of course, they had to go inside and check it out. Inside the house was a vintage cottage-style home that was probably built in the late 40s or early 50s, and the group was instantly met with writing and symbols in strange Latin-like languages, with a few English graffiti pieces that quoted a supposed satanic or pagan worshipping ritual, with certain pieces describing how to sacrifice a human soul to some supposedly demonic deity. My father still claims to this day that certain symbols were painted on the walls in blood, while others were clearly spray paint, and I find it easier to believe because he also worked as a firefighter for years before this happened and had a lot of experience with having to see human blood and dismembered bodies on the freeway after car accidents. Past a small living area/kitchen area was a stairwell that was so small that their shoulders would physically brush either side of the wall as they went up, and the stairs went straight, stopped at a small landing, and then turned right, so as you started up, you couldn't see what might be standing at the top. At the top of the stairs, a door led to a large attic-styled bedroom where actual chain manacles and locks hung from one of the walls near a circular window at the end of the room, which was also completely covered in weird symbols, graffiti, and now more obvious and frightening large dried puddles of blood that had seeped into the floors and walls. Allegedly, once they were upstairs investigating the room, they swear that they heard someone moving up the stairwell behind them quickly, but when they looked back, there was no one there. Everyone essentially told me that it sounded almost like heels clacking on wood, and now completely spooked, they rushed back down the stairs to see if someone was playing a prank on them and was hiding downstairs. Surprise, surprise, they found nothing, and no new footprints in the dust and grime that differed from the ones they left on their way in. To keep things interesting, I met with each of the guys separately to ask them about what they remembered, expecting to maybe find a crack or something to prove that maybe they were exaggerating. But when I asked them, I got the same answer from each of them with no hesitation. They got the same details right down to the minute that they entered the house and the minute they left. But here's where it gets really strange. They left the house and, for some unknown reason, decided to try walking back from a different route, using a compass to approach from the east instead of the south. They did this test more than 10 times that night, walking from every possible route or direction, yet they always came out at the front entrance of the house, even when the compass and common knowledge of the area showed that it was physically impossible to be at the south end of the house when they moved in a straight line from the north, east, or the west. There probably is some scientific explanation for it, but I haven't found one yet. These guys knew those woods literally like the back of their hand and still do to this day. The final time that the guys came back and found themselves standing at the front door of the house, they began to feel physically ill, verging on feverish, and they finally decide that it's time to give up when one of them nearly faints, and as they turn to leave, the man who nearly fainted turns, looks up, and points at the circular window at the front of the house on the second story. Everyone looks and immediately sees a tall, female figure hunched over, standing in the window, watching them. Though they see no features on her face other than two large, dark-colored eyes, and it's sort of shuffled in place slightly before turning and walking away as if it were heading to the stairs at the end of the room. At the sight of the figure actually moving, they all took off running through the woods, ending up on the side of the interstate about 3 miles from my dad's house, which is where they originally started from. They eventually made it back to my dad's place, though they claimed that they felt as if someone were following them the entire way, and my dad's cousin gets up to get some water from the kitchen, only to announce that he swore that he saw the same figure standing outside the kitchen window near the edge of the woods. Thankfully, nothing ever came from the experience, well, other than a collective state of absolute terror when the subject is brought up. They wrote off what his cousin saw as paranoia or pareidolia, though 5 years later, they decided to return to see if the house was still standing. Miraculously, it had fallen in on itself and was nothing more than a pile of rubble, and they never went back. I always joked with my dad and would ask him what he would do if he went back and found the house standing the same way that it had back then, trying to give him a reason to let me go and see the place for myself, but with trespassing laws being far more prevalent in today's times, it would be nearly impossible without either getting shot or going to jail, as it wasn't on our property. I don't know. It always gives me the creeps thinking about it, but I never considered the story to be true until I did this little mock interview with all the guys. And when I say that these grown men are scared to death by this story, I mean it. Seeing them get physically worked up and frightened by just telling the story really caused me to be less of a skeptic. Could it be possible that they were just spooked and it caused them to see things? What do you think? The one thing that I learned that weekend was to never stay up past 3 a.m. at a Canadian cottage next to a forest and a haunted lake. When I was 13, I had this friend named Veronica. We both were obsessed with scary stories and legends, and one weekend, she invited me to stay at her cottage. We had lots of fun during the day. We went swimming, hiking, kayaking, and we played video games. When it got dark, we decided to try and stay up all night, but first, we wanted to see if the Canadian legend of the Wendigo was true. We waited for it to get darker, and then we told her 16-year-old sister that we were going to go to the forest to see if the Wendigo legend was true. Her sister believed in this kind of stuff, but was too scared to see if it was really real. She called us insane and said it was a horrible idea. But nevertheless, I grabbed the flashlight in my friend's hand and we ran to the woods. The legend says to summon the Wendigo, you must whistle in a Canadian forest at night. Lucky for me, I didn't know how to whistle, so Veronica had to be the one to do it. She did, and then we stood there, as quiet as could be. 5 seconds go by. Now 10 seconds. We were about to calmly walk out of the forest, but then we heard a twig snap. The snap was followed by a noise that sounded like a moose mixed with a human groan. We ran back to the cottage as fast as we could. We didn't tell her sister anything. We just went straight to the room that we were staying in. We were bored, so she told me about a legend that was going around the neighborhood. The legend claimed that if you go to the lake at 3 a.m. and tap your foot in the water 3 times, something will try to pull you down into the water. If there's no one there to help you, you're doomed. For some reason, we decided that we should go out and try it. Well, We snuck into the kitchen when everyone was asleep to get some ice cream and coffee in order to not fall asleep, and eventually 3 a.m. arrived. We did what the legends said, but I only felt something touch my foot. After that, we thought the rest of the night was going to be normal, but boy, were we wrong. We changed our minds about not sleeping at all and got ready for bed. We were too scared to turn the lights off, so we just turned them down, but maybe it would have been less scary with them off. Because about an hour later, I still couldn't sleep. I turned to Veronica and I opened my eyes, and her eyes were wide open. I asked her what's wrong, but all she said was, "Don't look in the corner." But I did. I saw a tall, black figure standing there. I looked back at Veronica, and she asked, "Is it gone?" We both looked back at the corner. It was in fact gone. I said, "It looks like it." We didn't get any sleep that night. And the worst thing was that we had to stay there another night. The year this incident occurred was 1993, and my grandparents are settling into bed. Now, I'm not alive at this point yet. My mom and her sisters were teenagers when this happened. The layout of the house is a hallway with doors to the left and right near the middle, and also the end. The doors weren't exactly across from each other either. My grandparents' room was the room to the right at the end of the hallway. Anyway, it was night, and my grandparents were in their bed. Suddenly, a red balloon floated into their room somehow. Now, this is very scary considering that this red balloon would have had to go up the stairs, through the hallway, get to the end, and then turn into my grandparents' room. Another strange thing about this was that my grandparents didn't remember seeing any balloons in their house the day before. My grandpa said that he remembered that the balloon didn't even float at the ceiling, but in the middle, between the floor and the ceiling. Now, here is the very scary part. The balloon floated to the end of their bed and just stopped there. To this day, my grandparents have no idea what caused this weird incident. However, the house that they are in has had some weird stuff happen in it from time to time, but I'll get to that another time. The story doesn't end there. Fast forward 27 years to 2020, and in the same town where that weird thing happened in 1993, the 5 people went missing, and 3 of them were kids, and one of those kids was found dead in a cornfield. And my grandpa told me that there was this clown sighting in the 90s in the same town where all this was happening. Is this just a coincidence that 27 years later, which is how long it takes Pennywise to come back, from that red balloon incident, which the red balloon is literally its symbol, and then people are going missing? Last weekend, I went to my grandparents' house, and luckily I didn't get kidnapped by Pennywise, but something strange still happened. So in the morning after the first night there, I was basically half asleep and half awake, but I could hear that everyone else was up. I liked to sleep in, so I just stopped myself from waking up. However, for some reason, I thought I was still at my house, so when I heard footsteps coming towards me, I thought it was my mom coming to wake me up. And suddenly, I felt someone tap a few times on my back, and my mind processed that as being my mom's attempt to wake me up. Right away, however, I turned over, and there was no one in sight. More than a little creeped out, I tried to think of a rational explanation. And then I started thinking about Pennywise, and I creeped myself out too much, so I went upstairs. Nothing happened to me for the rest of the time, though. But I still wonder, is something like it real and terrorizing this town every 27 years? Or is this all just a coincidence? This took place around mid-October of 2021. I had been spending time with an individual that I considered a love interest. I'll call them Sig, since they smoked a lot. Sig made it clear that they also viewed me as a love interest as well, so things were pretty chill. We never had an official relationship because I decided to stop seeing them, partly due to their role in this story. It was pretty late one night, and I was completely ready to just face plant onto my pillow. I couldn't be bothered to brush my teeth. I fell asleep instantly, and then I woke up. Except my alarm didn't go off, and it was still pitch black outside my window. It wasn't that big of a deal. I woke up in the middle of the night somewhat often, but someone was standing next to me, right up against the bed. For a time, I pretended to still be asleep, as if that would change anything. The person then took my hand and placed it on their stomach. Yeah, it's weird, I know. I have no idea why they did this. I never got an answer. I wasn't really questioning that at the time. I was more focused on, not getting killed. Anyway, by touch, I was almost 100% certain this was Sig. For a split second in my mind, I relaxed until I remembered that they lived 40 minutes away from my house and they couldn't drive. And, how the frick did they get into my house without a key? My phone was so close to me, but I was too scared to move. My heart was beating out of my chest. Until that night, I don't think I'd ever feared for my safety to that extent. They just stood there, unwavering. I didn't know what the heck they wanted, if anything. I thought of a scheme that I thought would take them off guard. To be blatantly honest, at this point, my mind desperately wanted to believe that it was Sig, so my strategy revolved around that line of thinking. I've never told Sig that I loved them, because I didn't, and we hadn't even been seeing each other long enough to merit that kind of feeling. So I thought I could throw them off guard. I told them that I loved them, that they were my world, all that cheesy nonsense. The next thing I knew, my hand was just hovering, not touching anything. Oddly enough, it felt like my heartbeat quickened for a couple seconds after I realized they were gone, and that maybe it was a nightmare. I honestly can't decipher if I was dreaming or not, or if my brain was mixing nightmare with reality. The closest thing that I can compare this to would be sleep paralysis. Though I could move, I believe I wasn't seeing and feeling something that wasn't actually there. So far, it's the weirdest and scariest experience that I've ever had. I never checked the clock. For me, personally, that's a big deal. My parents didn't take it too seriously, and I guess that's why it was easy for me to brush off. Though, sometimes, I can take myself back to that horrible feeling. I felt helpless. I was terrified. I lock my door every time I'm in my bedroom now, day or night. But looking back, one good thing that came out of it was realizing that I'm not really ready to die. I've had issues in the past with depression, and this kind of cleared everything up, Whether my brain tells me I want to die, now I know I'm truly not ready for it to all be over. Here's some background information. I'm a 27-year-old male living in Australia with a Chinese/Papua New Guinea/German background. Dad and his side of the family is largely superstitious. My siblings and I are rather out of touch with spiritual beliefs and Chinese culture as we grew up in Australia. My story was thought nothing more of but a sleepy night terror until I remembered something my grandmother told me as a teenager. I thought you might enjoy my story. Here it is. About 14 years ago, when I was living in my family home, I was getting into the habit of rearranging my room just for the satisfaction of it. It always felt refreshing to do a mass clean and reset the layout of my bedroom. My grandmother had traveled interstate to visit my dad and the rest of our family. My dad's side of the family lives around his mother. My grandmother walked by my bedroom to say hello, and she saw that I had rearranged my bed to face the door. She warned me that that can attract spirits and ruin your sleep, continuing to explain that it was a bad omen to arrange your bed in such a way. Our family has a Chinese background. A quick Google and you'll find things linked to bad feng shui and feelings of dissatisfaction. The scariest thing that I've found is the cultural belief that spirits may drag you out of the door against your will. All cultural superstition about feet facing the door whilst sleeping. Now, prior to sharing this story, I found a comment on YouTube of someone sharing a similar legend where sleeping facing an open window can create a spiritual portal between worlds, can attract bad omens and spirits, etc., which is not far off from what my own family has spoken about before. Anyway, raised in Western culture Australia, my grandmother's warning wasn't so much something I believed, but it did scare me a little bit at the time, as I was like 12 or 13 living at home. Nothing ever happened in that house, probably because I lived in a house full of family. I kept the door closed as a kid because I was afraid of the dark, and as a teenager I kept it closed for privacy. Years later, when I had moved out as an adult and on my own in 2017, I once again set up my bedroom with the bed facing the door. I loved this apartment and had since outgrown my fear of the dark, which meant I wouldn't close my bedroom door at night while I was asleep anymore. Basically, the whole apartment felt like it was my bedroom, right? I was situated in a nice enough suburb about 15 minutes drive from the city, so not rural, but safe enough to walk to the gym at 12 a.m. when I couldn't sleep. I felt very safe here. In that same apartment, I'm on the phone with a friend. It's a long call from 10 p.m. until about 3 a.m. at this point, and she says, "I'll be right back. I need to use the bathroom." I'm extremely sleep deprived at this point, and the only thing that was keeping me up was our conversation. So I'm in bed, staring through my open bedroom door. It's a pitch black hallway that leads to the front door. All the curtains are closed up at the front end of the apartment, but I have some moonlight peeking through the blinds behind my bed. I'm fighting to stay awake, but I'm falling in and out of consciousness, and my head is dropping like it's as heavy as bricks. My eyes close and I open them back up. Nothing. They close again, and I fight to open them. Still nothing. My eyes close for a third time, and I open them. Now, there's a woman standing in my bedroom doorway, roughly 2 paces away from the foot of my bed. She's tall, has long arms, pale skin, long black hair covering her face, wearing dirty white rags, and she's hunched over. It's the only way she can fit inside the doorframe. My eyes shot open in fear, and I'm literally staring at this thing. I blink, then she's lunged at the bed. The moment her hand touched the foot of my bed, I blinked again. Now the woman's vanished. My grandmother may have been right, or it could have been the one and only night terror I've ever experienced, but I felt true fear in that moment. I got out of bed and closed my door. I don't think I ever slept without that door closed in that apartment after that night. Conveniently, my friend returns to the phone call once this is over. Well, my grandmother was Chinese and Papua New Guinean for any background on her spiritual relation to ghosts and legends. I've had one other ghost sighting since then as an adult in my family home in 2020, but not nearly as dramatic, thankfully. However, my dad experienced a lot as a young man, typically around times of loss in the family. If you made it this far into the video, hit subscribe if you haven't already, and click the video on the screen to hear more. Alright, so check this out. When I was a kid, I lived in a haunted house. I'll preface this by saying I'm generally a very rational person and am a skeptic by nature. I didn't grow up in a family that was religious or into the supernatural, And if I hadn't experienced these things myself, there's no doubt in my mind that I wouldn't believe in it today. Our house was built in 1912. On the outside, it seemed like a totally normal house. The moment I stepped inside that house, I felt uneasy, and I just couldn't explain why. My sister and I shared a room upstairs. I was sitting on my bed in my room one day, facing the doorway. It was one of those accordion doors that would click closed, and there was a space of about 2 feet at the bottom where it didn't reach the floor. It was only my mom and I home at the time, and she was downstairs. I heard the floor creak outside my door in the hallway as if someone was walking into my room. Then I saw a white mist-type figure pass by my door. At first, I thought it was my mom bringing laundry upstairs, and I waited for her feet to appear under the door, but they never did. I went and peeked under my door to see who was in the hallway, but there was nobody there. There was no wind, and no way it could have been a curtain blowing. I definitely saw something pass by my door. Another day, I was in my room alone again. My family was downstairs in the kitchen at the time. There was a wardrobe by the door that had a lamp on top of it. I was just sitting on my bed again, and all of a sudden, the lamp started to violently rock back and forth. It scared the crap out of me, so I immediately ran downstairs, and my family could see that I was scared, and they asked me what was wrong. I told them what happened, and they all looked at each other. I discovered later that they tried to protect me from knowing any of the paranormal experiences that have been happening there. Another day, my sister and I were in the living room. It was summer, and we had one of those window air conditioners in the kitchen window. My dad had just finished building a detached garage outside and had turned the breaker off so that he could finish wiring the electrical to the garage. There was no electricity at all in the house, and we were just sitting there, and all of a sudden, we hear the air conditioner turn on. My sister and I looked at each other and ran outside. My parents asked us what was wrong, and we told them how the air conditioner turned on all by itself. My dad said that's impossible. There's no electricity going to the house, and we had no explanation for how it turned on. Another day, I was in my room, and we had one of those big fans that actually sat on the floor. My sister would always yell at me for leaving it on when I wasn't in the room. And on this day, it was really hot, so I purposely left the fan on. I went downstairs to have a shower, only my mom and sister were home at the time, and I came back up to my room, and the fan was switched off. I immediately felt uneasy because I knew that I had left it on. So I asked my mom and my sister if they had gone upstairs while I was in the shower, but they hadn't. There was no explanation for how it turned off. This was back in the days where we would record songs off the radio on cassette tapes. One day, I guess I forgot to press stop while recording, and I had left the room. When I listened back, it sounded like a man and a woman were arguing on the tape, but I couldn't quite make out what they were saying. There was no one in the room at the time either. When I would go to sleep at night, and the lights were out, I would see what I now know were probably orbs, but at the time, I had no idea what they were. It was like static electricity in the air. I don't know how to explain it. The closest thing I've ever seen to it are sparklers. It used to scare the crap out of me, and I would run to my mom's room to tell her, and she would say, "Oh, it's just your eyes playing tricks on you. Don't pay any attention to it." I would go back to bed and hide my head under the covers. And there was a spirit that would stand in the corner of my room and just watch us constantly. After we moved out, I told my mom one day that our new house felt so much happier than our old one. And she asked me what I meant, and I told her how Our old house had such a heavy atmosphere and felt totally different, and I always felt like I was just being watched. I asked her if it was haunted, and she finally admitted that it had been and that they had tried to protect me from it because I was the youngest. I described two of the ghosts to her, the female that was always in the corner of my room, and the male spirit that stayed in my brother's room. I described the time period they were from and how they were dressed. I described how the woman was in a long, dark dress, and the man sat on the floor in my brother's room and just looked out the window. No idea how I knew these things, and turned out I was pretty close, except for the woman wore a black veil that hid her face, and the man actually had no legs, which is why I thought he was sitting all the time. While we lived there, I had a recurring dream where I saw a little girl in a white nightgown cowering in the hallway outside my bedroom and crying because the house was on fire. I was constantly paranoid about fires while living in that house and would constantly check the electrical outlets throughout the house to be sure that everything was okay. After we moved, I worked at our local library, and there were tons of resources about the history of the town. Turns out, before our old house was built at that location, there was a hotel that used to stand there in the late 1800s that had been burned to the ground, killing several people. My dad was the only one who didn't have experiences while we lived there. My mom had the most experiences, and I think at first he started to think that she was losing her mind. It wasn't until my siblings and I started to tell him about our experiences, and specifically me with the lamp incident in my room, that he started to think something was actually wrong with the house. My brother worked late nights and would get home around midnight. He would walk through the dark house to get to his room and would often hear someone calling his name. He thought it was our mom and would go in her room to see what she wanted, only to find her asleep. Eventually, he would rarely sleep there. He would sleep at his friends' or his girlfriend's houses instead. My sister and I shared a room. We had the female ghost dressed in a black veil who would stand and watch us in the corner of our room. One night, my sister woke up to find someone sitting beside her on her bed holding her hand. She thought it was me and asked what I was doing, but got no answer. She looked over at my bed, and I was there, sound asleep. She looked back, and the figure was then gone. To this day, she sleeps with her head under the covers and her arms tucked under her. My mom had multiple experiences, and I'm not even aware of all of them, and honestly, I don't want to be. I know she said that there were at least 5 spirits in the house, plus others that would pass through. In our basement, we had an old, cold room, and this is apparently where the spirit portal was located in our house. I'm not sure why it was there or how it got there, but I think previous residents had dabbled in things that maybe they shouldn't have. As I said previously, there was a hotel that had burned down at that location, killing several people. I think that previous residents could sense the presence of these spirits and dabbled with Ouija boards or seances to contact the spirits and ended up inviting in dark entities instead. It's just a theory, but I believe people who lived there before us made the situation worse. My mom is very sensitive to spirits and had experiences with all of them, I think. The woman in black was a protective spirit and would communicate with my mom quite a bit. I believed that spirit protected me from the other spirits as well. My mom was walking down to the basement one day and she lost her footing and started to fall. She suddenly felt hands on her chest and pushed her back to an upright position. She never saw anyone, and she just felt them catch her as she fell. Another day, she was vacuuming in my brother's room when the phone rang. She ran downstairs to answer it, and while she was downstairs, she heard the vacuum start up and being pushed across the floor. She ran back upstairs, but by the time she got there, it had stopped, and she was the only one home at the time. We had so many issues with phantom calls in that house, and this is before cell phones, so we only had a landline. The phone would ring constantly and no one would be on the line. Or we would just hear static, or as though there was a muffled voice on the line, but we couldn't make out what they were trying to say. I don't know how many times we had the phone company come check it out, only to find nothing was wrong. Then, it escalated. My dad would get up to leave for work in the middle of the night, and just after he would leave, we would get a call where a person would say, "Hey, I saw Dwight leave for work." This freaked my mom right out, so the police became involved to try and trace where these calls were coming from. We had to keep track of the time the calls came in, what was said, if anything, and etc. They never were able to trace the calls. We moved shortly after and had the same phone number. The calls stopped as soon as we moved out, and we never had issues again. Before we moved, my mom was really worried that they would follow us. The woman in black was very religious, and my mom had an old Bible beside her bed. One morning, she woke up to find the Bible open beside her on the nightstand, and these words were highlighted. They said, "And this house will be my home forever." Thankfully, they didn't follow us. Now, I'm very sensitive to spirits, and I've had other experiences throughout my life, but that'll be for another day. I hated that house, and I was so happy to move. I'm grateful for the experience, though, because now I know our spirits do continue on after death, just in a different way. I used to rent a room in Hartford. My landlady and her kid also shared the house, and for a time another woman, but she bounced a check and she was evicted. I lived in her master bedroom. It was a small house with glass doorknobs and wooden floors. It was quite nice, and maybe it was built in the 30s. You had to walk up a small hill to get into the house. This house was near Trinity College in a so-so area. It was actually a really cool neighborhood, especially around Halloween, and the neighbors went all out for the holidays with decorations. Her husband had passed, and the house, from the beginning, felt stressful. I had some strange experiences. The first one was finding the words blood and the F word spray painted behind the stairs in her laundry area. I didn't know who did it or why, and really I was too scared to ask. I was raised a superstitious Catholic, so seeing that really freaked me out. The next weird experience happened when my landlady was at her boyfriend's house, who lived in another town. She would go there some weekends and leave the house to me, while her kid would stay at a friend's house. One night, I was in her living room. She had a pellet stove, and it made the house very cozy in the wintertime. I was sitting by it when I had this overwhelming feeling that someone was in the room, standing next to me. I left and went upstairs, feeling quite freaked. Then things got weirder. The room I was in felt increasingly colder at night, for no reason. And then it happened. One night, I woke up around 4:30 in the morning and looked at the coffee table at the end of the room. That's when I saw it. It was a dark face with curly hair surrounding it, kind of hovering there and staring at me. It had no features, but I knew somehow that it was a man's face. I screamed and turned on the light. Later, the landlady's boyfriend told me, kind of out of the blue, that my landlady's dead husband had beat her and the neighbors called him evil. And my landlady, who was very proud of her son, showed me a photo of her son as a little boy, and his father was in it. He had curly hair. I think I somehow manifested this person's dark spirit, or else sensed an emotional imprint because what I felt in that room that night was definitely something evil. When I was about 7 or 8 years old, I remember going to sleep over at a kid's house. I'll call him Richard, though this was a long time ago and I may be forgetting what his real name is. Their parents were friends with my parents, so we weren't very close friends, but I was still very happy about it. He had what may have been the coolest thing for a kid in the 80s to ever see. He had a Pac-Man arcade cabinet in his basement. Now, to help understand this story, you need to understand the layout of the house. This was a raised ranch. You walked in the front door, looking at a small set of stairs that led down to a finished basement area, and a similar set of stairs right next to it going up to the main floor. You could see the kitchen from the landing up the stairs as you entered the house, and to the right was the living room. The left side of the main floor was a hallway that led to 3 bedrooms and the bathroom. One of the bedrooms was Richard's, where I would be sleeping with another one of his friends. I'll call him Michael, and again, I don't remember if that was his real name or not. But the basement was what I focused on, because as you went down to the basement family room, there was a hallway that has a small room to the left where the arcade cabinet was. It was a small room covered with brown wood paneling, like all basements in the 80s had. The front door of the coin receptacle was left open, so you didn't need any quarters to play. You would just flick the little metal pin to mimic a quarter and start playing. This is where I wanted to go, but it was time for bed. Now, going into Richard's room, it was covered in WWE, or at the time it was WWF, posters and toys. I wasn't into them as the two of them were. I mean, I liked Nintendo and stuff like that, but we still played with them like kids do, and we ended up staying up very late, much too late, because the parents just let us do whatever, which was also common in the 80s, and that was great. This was also my first real sleepover where we had run of the house. Considering we were 3 boys not being watched, we weren't doing anything dangerous. We were play wrestling, watching TV in his room, and just going to the kitchen for junk food. However, we weren't playing Pac-Man. Yet, I thought. At some point, I'm sitting in Richard's room by myself, and the two of them left for some reason, and I felt a little uncomfortable for whatever silly reason. They were gone a long time. Self-conscious over the fact that I wasn't close friends with either of them, I asked myself, what were they doing without me? Let me go check. I leave the room, walking towards the basement, thinking that must be it. Even if they weren't there, I could still get to play, so win-win. I walked down the stairs to the basement where it was dark, but bright enough to see. It may have been a full moon, or there were outside lights because I didn't need to turn on any lights to really see. I saw the room, and I saw the hallway where the arcade awaits. But then Richard walked out and stood in front of me. He didn't say anything, and he was in his underwear. This was very uncomfortable because he looked mad, like he didn't want me to go down there. I stood on the bottom step, not moving for a while, none of us saying anything. Finally, I figured, okay, you don't want me down here, and then I went back upstairs just to go to bed. I looked up the second stairs towards the kitchen, and this is where the chill crawled up my spine. Richard and Michael were in the kitchen, getting something to eat, and they were there the whole time. Now, Richard was an only child, and there was no one else in the house other than his mother and father, which were asleep across the hall. There was no other way from the basement to the kitchen other than maybe from outside. They couldn't have walked past me without me knowing, and there wasn't enough time to put clothes back on and get back into the kitchen if they were just pranking me. They also didn't say anything about what I saw because, well, I said nothing, thinking if they were pranking me, they would have mentioned it. Well, I went into the kitchen and I ate some food and went right to bed. Again, if this was a joke, A 7 to 8 year old boy would have said something. Didn't say a word to anyone about the kid in the basement. To this day, I have no explanation for this. It's spooky season, which always gets me talking with buddies about the creepy things we've been through. I almost never touch on this story though, because it's not one of those classic scary stories everyone likes to share around a few beers. I used to work night shifts at this large manufacturing facility. Night shift was a very small crew. There was only about 5 of us. As admin staff, I sat with security as they'd switch between patrolling and monitoring the cameras. It was usually pretty silent and boring. Now, I'm not sure how the building got its haunted story. No one besides us ever wanted to work nights because of the rumors, and none of us ever had any experiences. No one died there. No crazy accidents ever happened. It wasn't destroyed and rebuilt. It was really peaceful and uneventful. But stories always spread, as they tend to do with big, dark, creepy spaces like this. And it was creepy. It's surrounded with woods, circled with fencing, mostly empty at night, which made it feel incredibly imposing and empty, and creepy motion-activated lights inside and out. Sounds carried and echoed, but still none of us ever had any experiences there until this. It was around Halloween, maybe a week or two before, and I was halfway into my shift, making it my lunch hour. It was chilly, and I went to my car to grab my bigger jacket and have a little smoke break. I was right outside the back door, which the fencing runs closest to. It's maybe 10 yards off the back door. The only light is motion activated, and I had to keep making big arm movements just to keep it on. It's all grass and shadows up to the fence, and the light doesn't really hit far beyond that. I was watching videos on my phone, and the light cut out. I sat in the dark a bit, just sipping my coffee and finishing my cigarette. As I was finishing, I reached up and waved about to activate the light and to find the ashtray. But as the light flickered on, I heard a noise at the fence across from me. We do get some animals out there, and they could get startled. It was all explained in my head pretty instantly. But as I stood up, I heard the fence continue to slightly jingle. When I looked up, I didn't see much. The light didn't really illuminate much outside its circle on the ground. And I don't know why, but my first thought was to say, "Hello?" When I did, the sound stopped for a moment. I squinted into the darkness, trying to adjust, and then the light went out. There in the darkness, the moon had a little more effect lighting up the area. The fence started lightly jingling again, very lightly. As my eyes adjusted a little better, I started to see movement. It looked like a person opposite me at the fence, fidgeting with the links. I thought, okay, this must be a kid trying to spook me. Maybe they were gonna break in and ghost hunt. Some high school kids have before without knowing the building never closed and that we were actually pretty cool with them poking around as long as they didn't touch anything and made it fast so that they could run and tell their friends that they lived through it. But that wasn't very common. And this was one person, all by himself. It felt off. I radioed in with my walkie to desk security. We have a visitor out by the north door behind the fence. I've seen the monitors on camera feed, and I know this area is totally covered. They'd be able to see the fence clearly. My walkie beeped back and the voice said, "We aren't reading any movement at the fence. Is it in the tree line?" I said negative. They're fiddling with the fence right in front of me. This all happened in the span of seconds. My cigarette butt was still in my hands, and I just barely swallowed my last sip of coffee. They didn't even have the chance to reply to me when, from the fence, I heard this massively louder thrash of the lynx, and all I saw was the figure full-on sprinting at me. I made a terribly embarrassing choking noise and crushed my coffee cup against the doorknob, trying to rush myself in. The fence is so close, it's not going to take more than a few bounds to reach me. I pushed myself in so hard, and I held the knob in place, trying to jiggle the deadbolt into place. The knob was flicking down hard against my hold, and I could hear and feel something moving against the opposite side of the door. I radioed back, "Get down here now," but I already heard steps coming my way. The knob stopped moving by the time they got there, and it was all over with. Back at the office, the security staff tried to play it off like I was just having a laugh about it, like this was a great Halloween joke that I was playing. I didn't understand why they weren't taking it seriously until I saw the playback. It was just me outside, and there was nothing else there. My brain couldn't really explain what I experienced outside while confronting the video. I immediately thought this was a big goof on me. Maybe they fiddled with the footage and had someone scare me, but they thought that genuinely I was the one goofing them. We were doing the whole back and forth, okay, whose idea was this? Who's messing with who thing? Until the second time watching the playthrough. We noticed the way the door handle kept moving even when I removed my hand from it. Both the inside camera and the outside camera caught it. I noticed right before I panicked and turned to run inside, the fence made a slight jolt as if it was being pushed. There were no holes in the fence or any kind of cuts made where someone could squeeze through. There was no creepy shadows or unexplained wisps of smoke or lights or movements beside mine. Just me in the night, jumping out of my skin and running inside. I kept trying to think back to when I jumped, when that figure burst at me full speed, if the light activated for their movement or for mine. I couldn't decide. I couldn't remember exactly because it was so fast. But nobody there wanted to admit anything happened to me. It was tricks of the moonlight, an overactive imagination, and too much coffee. Branches against the chain links, no one's ever experienced anything weird here, and it wouldn't just start up for no reason. I didn't make a fuss, and I didn't want to argue about it. They already thought I was being weird, and maybe I was. I went about finishing my shift, but no one used the back door again that night, and it remained locked. The longest employed security was finishing up the shift at the desk with me in the office. It was right before dawn, and the morning shift was trickling in the parking lot. He watched the cameras in silence while I typed away. A few minutes before clocking out, he cleared his throat and he told me, "I never really liked the North End. It feels like someone's eyes are always on me." It's honestly the most he's ever said to me in the year plus that I worked there. That's the most I've ever heard him say. I felt like that statement held even more weight because of that. I didn't quit though. I stayed on another 7 months until the company was bought out and they stopped overnight shift to pile more work on the day shifts for less money with less employees. There was never another incident. I never actually went out there again though. I stopped smoking, I took my breaks in the lobby, or wasted time just chatting with coworkers, but I made excuses not to sit outside, to be honest. I feel like a few of us there did. I've never before or since had any moments where I felt like my imagination got the better of me, and I truly believe that wasn't the case here. I keep thinking back at the door handle jerking down when I was just steps away yelling into the walkie. That had to be proof that I wasn't imagining the whole thing. No one ever brought it up again, and whenever anyone asked about working in the old crappy factory, everyone would say, "Oh, we never saw anything up there. It's just a boring building at night." I would just smile and keep my side of the story to myself, but I wondered if anyone else was holding stories to themselves too, and that maybe they'd slip out after a few beers and field a few more questions about the haunted factory. If you made it this far into the episode, then, well, congratulations. We're best friends now. If you're listening on YouTube, subscribe if you haven't already. And if you're listening on a podcast, leave me a review. I'll see you in the next one.